A warm welcome to wherever you may be tuning in from. I'm Elina Noor, Director, Political Security Affairs and Deputy Director of the Washington, D.C. office at the Asia Society Policy Institute. Thank you for joining us in this discussion today, asking the question of whether minilateralism is the future of the Indo-Pacific. The return of the Quad with a more concrete agenda, as well as the announcement of what looks set to be a long-term Australia, United Kingdom, United States, or AUKUS arrangement, elicited a range of responses across the Asia-Pacific or the Indo-Pacific region, from welcoming to guarded to concerned. But minilaterals, or arrangements of smaller groupings of countries with shared or common objectives, are not wholly new. The Quad, of course, has its roots in the wake of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and in Southeast Asia, the Malacca Strait Patrol and Trilateral Maritime Patrol are existing examples of minilateral cooperation in practice. Can minilateral arrangements be more effective, or do they risk undermining multilateralism and the notion of regionalism in general? How might the Quad or even AUKUS and ASEAN engage with each other constructively? We have an excellent panel of policy thinkers and practitioners to unpack these and other questions today. So what we'll do is we'll get started with the main attraction, our panel. Professor Mie Oba, or Oba Mie, at the Faculty of Law, Kanagawa University, focuses on international relations, politics, and the development of regionalism in East Asia and the Asia Pacific. She is also very well steeped in Japan's approach to regionalism and its relationship with Southeast Asia, having published widely on the subject in both Japanese and English. Professor Thitinan Pongsudhirak is at Bangkok's Chulalongkorn University and Director of the Institute of Security and International Studies, Thailand. He is a prolific writer. I need to get some tips from him, having authored many academic publications and over 1,000 op-eds on issues such as comparative politics, as well as the geopolitics and geoeconomics of ASEAN and East Asia. Ambassador Pou Sothirak is Executive Director at the Cambodian Institute for Cooperation and Peace. He is also advisor to the Royal Government of Cambodia, having had a long and illustrious career serving his country as Secretary of State of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, as ambassador to Japan, and as member of Parliament twice, among other positions. Last, but certainly not least, my good friend Brian Harding, who is Senior Expert Southeast Asia at the US Institute of Peace. Brian was Deputy Director of the Southeast Asia Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Director for East and Southeast Asia Policy at the Center for American Progress, and was formerly in government serving as Country Director for Asian and Pacific Security Affairs at the Office of the Secretary of Defense at the Pentagon. I'll have a round of Q&A with our panelists for about 7 minutes each before opening up to interventions from the audience. For the audience, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your questions or comments at any time, and I'll try to get to as many as possible in the last half hour or so of this webinar. So perhaps I can start with Professor Oba. The idea of the Quad, of course, goes back to 2007 when Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo first proposed the idea. At the time, there was some ambiguity about what the real reason of the Quad was and how it might develop in the future, if at all. But recent Quad summits have offered some focus in pledging to manage the pandemic, the climate crisis, and critical and emerging technologies. How effective do you think has the Quad been, and what are its implications for continued practical cooperation among the 4 Quad countries and with other partners, especially in ASEAN, in the immediate future?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for my introduction. And then, so I'm so glad to join this webinar. So I really grateful to the ASPI and Noor area. And then, so Yes, when the Prime Minister Abe proposed and tried to promote the Quad in the 2007, so the four member countries' strategic interest and concern did not converge yet. So and the Quad was gone at once. So however, through the 2010s, so these four countries' security, cooperation, and dialogues bilaterally and trilaterally grew, and then so Quad revived in the 2017. So after that, the foreign ministers meetings and the summit meeting were already held, and the specific fields of the cooperation were specified. So the one reason of the development is the Biden administration's encouragement. So, but the more important reason is that the four countries is converging their strategic interest and concern, at least to some extent. So, and all of them recognize the necessity to address the various challenges and uncertainty in the Indo-Pacific. However, the stance of these four countries are still diverse. So, especially regarding China. So, India's stance toward China is ambiguous, even though if there is a military conflict on the border between the China and India, and Japan, Australia, and US more share their concern about China, but Australia's economy heavily depends on the China's market. And for Japan, China is the most important economic partner. And Japan also have to seriously consider the geographical proximity with China. So both Australia and Japan have to manage the relations with China in the deliberate manner. So in addition, regarding the stance towards the Russian invasion to Ukraine, so the four countries were divided into two groups. So US, Australia, and Japan clearly condemned the Russian military operation and the invasion and its claim about the Ukraine. And it's conducting economic sanctions towards Russia. So on the other hand, India is taking an independent stance, avoiding to criticize Russia. In the early this March, the leader of the Quad held an online meeting and talked about Ukraine issue. But from the statements by the four governments implied the disagreement among four countries. So rather, so it became it is because the diversity of these interests. So I believe the Quad is important to these countries. There are some reasons. The first, it functions as a platform to reiterate for countries' interest and concern to each other, and decide on the specific cooperation. So they have to cooperate and they have to promote and demonstrate both domestically and internationally their shared commitment to working together for peace and stability in the Indo-Pacific region. So without the Quad, so we do not have any framework to coordinate the diverse interests and concern among four countries, especially with India. So second, diversity among member countries might lead to Quad ambiguity, so as a strategic coalition. But such ambiguity is rather beneficial to get implicit support from the ASEAN countries, so which play an important role in the Indo-Pacific. The strategic ambiguity overlapped with the stance of the ASEAN countries and has served to soften their wariness of Quad. Some in ASEAN countries so implicitly welcome the Quad and AUKUS to balance the rise of China. At the same time, they do not welcome Quad overly anti-China approach. So I believe that the Quad strategic ambiguity may instead be beneficial in our effort to strengthen relations and dialogue with ASEAN countries. The third, the Quad is focusing on the cooperation to manage pandemic, to address the climate crisis, and to develop and share the critical and emerging technologies. It is related to not a traditional security, but non-traditional security fields. The Quad is including India and Japan. The whose defense activities are limited by the Constitution. So it is difficult for Quad to promote the cooperation regarding traditional security field. Instead, there is another minilateral framework, AUKUS. I think the complementarity between the AUKUS and Quad is becoming more important. So first, now economic statecraft is having more strategic significance to sustain the liberal international order. So from the point of view, Quad should and can promote the cooperation or the development and share of the high technology among them. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Oba. That's a great overview of the Quad and where you see it going. If I can turn to Ambassador Sothirak, Cambodia is ASEAN chair this year. What is the view from where you sit in Phnom Penh of the impacts of these minilateral arrangements on ASEAN unity and centrality, particularly with calls for an expanded Quad Plus arrangement that may include certain ASEAN countries? Are there points of common interest at all that could form the basis of collaboration among the Quad and ASEAN countries?
Okay, thank you, Elina. Not knowing exactly what you're asking, let me try to be productive here, and I will come back to Cambodian position with regard to Quad at the end of my presentation. But let me first thank you for inviting me or engaging me with this very stimulating public roundtable, and to dive deeper on the question, is minilateralism the future of Indo-Pacific? I am deeply privileged to be among other distinguished panelists. Now, the questions of minilateralism require proper understanding why multilateralism is losing its potency amid geopolitical uncertainty. And let me point out to some key factors that that challenge the spread of multilateralism, and then I will try to answer the roundtable question: is minilateralism the future of the Indo-Pacific? Now, the international order under the model of Pax Americana, whereas the exercise of the US powers and the end of World War II have developed a common set of institutions, rules, and norms to sustain peace and economic development, is no longer sustainable, at least in my view. The American first policy of President Donald Trump appeared to have forsaken the US-led international order. In trying to make America great again, his administration rejects globalization as a positive force, relinquishing its leadership role over multilateral rule-based order that we all enjoy and has been a cornerstone of the American policy and a source of the American hegemony. As much as we know that multilateralism is essential to our world vision, but also facing strong headwind. However, with the new US President Joe Biden in office, there is a real opportunity to work for its revival, even if it is not going to be an easy task. Now, the first difficulty lies in different ideas over the world about how to revitalize multilateralism. The second difficulty have to do with the multipolar and fractured world, when the political basis for multilateralism is now changing its contour, its characteristic, or rather influencing by whoever is a number one superpower. I wanted to make it very clear. Third, the rise of minilateralism, as we discussed, Quad, AUKUS, and so on. And there are in Southeast Asia 13 other minilateralism that we need to also include when we talk about the rise of minilateralism. Is further expansion to engage in other area in exclusionary. And one of your question, you can see it, this is something that ASEAN don't like it, and inherently challenging the that have made express commitment to multilateralism. In fact, you know, Elina, you and I know that throughout in Southeast Asia, you cannot find any country that explicitly say we promote minilateralism. They all say we promote multilateralism, and how they do it, they differ in the way they do it. By addressing the first difficulty, let me simply say that the United Nations system in resolving the crisis in Myanmar from military coup and the war in Ukraine by Russia invasion is simply unacceptable in my view. They cannot stop the war in Ukraine, and they cannot return normalcy to Myanmar. I wanted to start with that. The UN system, which was established in 1995 as a replacement for the League of the Nations after World War II, although they have good intention in its establishment, but over time, in my observation, it become a stockpile of vested interests of big powers, especially the P5, unable to bring friendly relationship among nations, helpless in enforcing common interests for all states, big and small, meaningfully, positively, and effectively. Now, my second point has to do with the shifting toward multipolar world, or at least toward a bipolar world order, that this challenge to multilateralism, and it have to adapt, in my view, to a new distribution of power, which while working to mitigate political fracturing of the world into competing poles. Now, the two biggest elephant in the room that's emerging is a Sino-American bipolarity, and it is increasingly, in my view, restructuring the world order. The decline of the U.S. preponderant power and the rise of unstoppable China, coupled with their intrinsic rivalry, will shape post-COVID-19 world order. And now there are renowned scholars who predicted the world will be less free, less open, and it become more Chinese-centric. But let me skip that. Now let me try to answer the question, is minilateralism the future of Indo-Pacific? My short answer is not quite the case. Here are some reasons why I say that. There remain a challenge inherently in minilateralism that need to be recognized as a Quad or the AUKUS move forward, specifically concern expressed regularly here in Southeast Asia, as well as among certain European analysts, that the rise of minilateralism and its further expansion to engage in other areas is exclusionary. I made that point earlier, and inherently challenge the state that have made express commitment to multilateralism. Why ASEAN? You look at ASEAN regional forums and the East Asia Summit have regularly and somewhat justifiably been criticized of lacking effectiveness on the ground. They remain highly valued by Southeast Asian states that do not want to see them sweep on the side, put it on the shelf, and as it were, and the expansion at the expense of the expansions of the Quad, for example. Both and the AUKUS, in my view, pay only lip service to whatever ASEAN is trying to do in promoting multilateralism. There are also questions of potential minilateral competitions and the development of multiple competing minilateral grouping. The growing need of minilateralism signal the need for specific cooperation with certain actors, given the idea to many to view it as a decline of multilateralism or selective multilateralism in this new multipolar international system. In Southeast Asia, the Mekong-US Partnership, Japan-Mekong Regional Partnership Program, the Mekong-Lamchang Cooperation, and many more are also examples of the minilateralism practicing in the region. And they're not working well. As I mentioned, there's competing interests there. In Southeast Asia, there are lingering concerns that minilateralism mechanisms are designed to serve major power interests and not the small state interests in ASEAN. So these are my view about the problem. But I have to say it is fair to mention that the growing prominence of minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific is attributed to the inability of ASEAN mechanism in resolving regional issues. These platforms are arguably emerged as a result of repeating ASEAN neglect, or more bluntly, inability to really strengthen its centrality and cohesiveness while engaging this external power, and therefore entrapping the regional bloc in the pressures to choose side. In conclusion, let me simply say that the further development of minilateralism frameworks such as a Quad and AUKUS can certainly be of benefit in the resolution of long-standing, seemingly intractable problem of withstanding big power ambition. Their developments so far have been generally positive. However, it must be sure not to put too much on its plate too soon or to run before it can walk. Being able to point to concrete achievement before significant expansion of its task list will be essential to avoid the potential negative externality, as I discussed just about. Now, finally, just simply answer your view about what Cambodia position with the Quad. As you know, Cambodia openly and very often officially mentioned we promote multilateralism. There's nowhere Cambodia issue statement on such and such minilateralism. But here in Cambodia and other Mekong country, as I mentioned, the US-led Mekong US partnership and the China's-led LMC is a true example of competing big power interests that make this region feel very uncomfortable, and they just don't know how to cope with the pressure, but they go along with all sides, but they are somewhat entrap themselves in not to choose side. They don't want to choose side, but it is very difficult not to choose sides in my view. So I stop here. Thank you, Elina.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sothirak. I think that was really useful to broaden it out to understand the rationale of minilateralism in the first place because of the weaknesses of multilateralism. But I suppose your point about the competing interests in the Mekong region raised the question, which perhaps we can discuss later, about what ASEAN's agency means in this competition. Let me turn to Professor Thitinan in Bangkok. There have been calls among some in Southeast Asia, particularly at the Track 2 level, that ASEAN should perhaps consider the ASEAN-X formula in dealing with political and security matters, not just economic affairs. After all, these minilateral security arrangements already exist among Southeast Asian countries outside of the ASEAN framework. Some might argue that, if anything, the current intractability in Myanmar only highlights the need for minilateralism to move the needle there. We know of the diversity of views in ASEAN. What do you say to this?
Okay, thank you very much, Elina, and warm good evening and good morning to all audience members and my fellow panelists. I want to thank Elina, first of all, for making this very kind of easygoing, informal roundtable. It facilitates conversation, and I think it feels very much at ease speaking to colleagues and friends on this panel. So just a few points in a short time ahead. First, I think the minilaterals are not a new phenomenon. We've had minilaterals for a long time, but I think that the focus that you have this evening from the ASPI on minilaterals is timely. Is a good opportunity to relook, and I think it's regaining a lot of traction. It's having a new impetus, new momentum, because I think the multilateral system multilateralism is very much at risk. And I mean, we might even say it's we've kind of kissing it goodbye by our focus on minilateralism. The backdrop for this is, the rules-based, so-called liberal rules-based liberal international order is kind of breaking down, it's unraveling, coming apart. And we've seen this over the years now. 30 years ago, we've had some minilaterals before. They were driven by geography. Remember those small trade triangles and trade agreements within Southeast Asia? The IMTGT, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, the Growth Triangle, the CJORI, Singapore, Johor, and Riau, the GMS, and so on. So we've had this kind of minilateral picking and choosing, common interests, interest-based, based on geography. And at the same time, did not include so many other external, extra-regional partners. So I think now the minilaterals are driven by two new phenomena. One is no longer confined to just geography. It's not no longer next door neighbors within the region. It involves external partners, external like-minded partners. And at the same time, there's a security focus, there's a kind of orientation towards regional security, international security, security interests. So these are the two, I think, trends that we're seeing with the new minilaterals. Now, we've talked about Quad and AUKUS, and I'll come back to it, but you can see that, these are not regionalized, these are, different, disparate, geographically disparate members coming together based on common interests. Even in the CPTPP, we had minilaterals, and for Southeast Asia, ASEAN, the only 4 members, Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei, not all ASEAN members. And RCEP is a little bit more inclusive, but, it had all ASEAN members, but not, multilateral per se. So that's my first point. Minilaterals, not a new phenomenon, but gaining new impetus, no longer based on geography, now involves disparate geography, but also external, extra-regional partners, players. Second, the US-China rivalry and competition is driving a lot of this, rising trend of minilaterals, like-mindedness, but not just US and China, but also other major powers too. And why is this so? Why are minilaterals kind of gaining traction, gaining more attention? Because ASEAN has been divisive. I think if there's a strong ASEAN, if there's a so-called ASEAN centrality, based on the ASEAN way and consensus and the mechanisms of ASEAN, if ASEAN can maintain its central organizing role for regional peace and security, the only game in town, then these minilaterals, I think, would not be getting so much traction. So I think the ASEAN divisiveness, ASEAN weakness at this time, I think possibly this is the lowest point of ASEAN in its 54 years of life and in its 23 years of being 10-member organization. So that's, my second point. Now, as a third point, I just say, if you look at the cases, we can have a series of case studies to see ASEAN weaknesses, to see the problematic ASEAN centrality. We saw 10 years ago at South China Sea when Cambodia chaired, and there was a lot of controversy. I don't have time to go into it, but we all know pretty well that the South China Sea has been divisive on ASEAN. And why? Because China is very much front and center. Even before the intensifying US-China rivalry, China very much had an incentive to divide ASEAN when it came to the South China Sea. But more recently, as you mentioned in your preface and opening remarks, Elina, Myanmar. I mean, Myanmar is the latest. Last February, just over a year ago, Myanmar had a military coup after a decade of political opening, economic reform, and some development progress. And after the coup, there's been a crisis, there's been a civil war, and ASEAN has been stuck, unable to address or do anything to show up the Myanmar crisis and to find an effective modality despite coming up with a 5-point consensus and despite a lot of talks and a lot of meetings, Myanmar has gone nowhere, and the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, is very much in charge and taking ASEAN for a ride, and ASEAN has no answer for it. Even Cambodia has chaired this year, tried very hard, but even Prime Minister Hun Sen has conceded that it's very difficult as long as the Myanmar military remains intransigent and intent to prevail and ride out this storm. Even the latest example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. This is a serious war, biggest war, the worst war in Europe since World War II. And ASEAN has been divided. You have Laos and Vietnam abstaining at the UNGA resolution condemning Russia for aggression against Ukraine. The other eight members of ASEAN supported the resolution, endorsed it. Even Cambodia, co-sponsors. So on the other hand, you have another outlier. ASEAN now is full of different outliers on different issues. Singapore has gone way out in front by imposing, its own sanctions on Russia. So on Russian invasion of Ukraine, very much divided. That's my third point. Now, coming to the last part of my presentation, and you mentioned this in the in your questions, Elina, about is it necessary to have this ASEAN minus X? If ASEAN as a whole, 10 member states cannot get their act together, can they pick and choose on different areas, different interests, different issues, minus X? And certainly we have minus X already. So minilaterals, it's not just a, we're going to see more of it in the future. It's already reality. We're heading that way, and we kind of, parting way with multilateralism. But ASEAN minus X, we have to be careful, because if you do, I think we're seeing that, and we'll see more of it. But if we see so much of it, we'll have ASEAN minus X on multiple tracks, and then we'll have ASEAN minus X plus Y plus Z plus ETC, which means that it will really multiply, and ASEAN will further dilute. So it's something that we have to be wary of. I'm not sure how much we can prevent that, but certainly ASEAN minus X is the way of the near future. We saw some of it already with CPTPP and Russia. We've seen Myanmar. In Myanmar, from the outset, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines were on one side, calling for the return to democratic process, dialogue, and democratic rule from the previous decade, and the rest stayed muted. So already we have ASEAN minus X. It hasn't worked out it hasn't been operationalized, and we have to be careful. Once it's operationalized in different ways on multiple tracks, it will further sap ASEAN's central role in the region. Finally, I'll just say we're seeing more and more, and I think this will be the way of the near future, like-minded minilaterals, based on a combination of values and interest in a moving mix. Certainly, I think interest, the poll in the beginning, unsurprisingly emphasized interest, but I think there's some values in there too. On Myanmar, it so happens that countries that supported democratic process return to democratic rule, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Philippines, among the ASEAN countries, these are the most democratic. So there's a kind of the underpinning autocracy, democracy kind of values-based kind of confrontation on Myanmar as well. ASEAN needs to think about new ways of doing things. I think, as a last remark, I'll just say, the whole structure has to be revamped completely. There might be some areas where majority voting is required. That's not the ASEAN way. It's not consensus, but consensus no longer works. So I think that if we go back to the original ASEAN 5, original ASEAN 5 back from 1967. If we have original ASEAN 5 plus X, that I think could be the way of the future for an effective, workable ASEAN that can still have some central role in organizing regional peace and security. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Prof. Thitinan. Certainly very provocative recommendations as far as ASEAN circles go. Maybe we can return to some of the themes that you raised later. Before I introduce Brian, I'd like to encourage the audience members to drop their questions or comments that they might have in the Q&A box, and we'll get to them after this. But I also would like to get the panelists themselves to respond to whatever comments that have been made, if they have any, if you have any comments to make. But Brian, let me turn to you. In the past couple of years, the United States has recommitted itself to multilateralism and ASEAN centrality in a number of ways. But it's also been a strong proponent of regional minilaterals, or minilaterals in general, as Professor Thitinan said. It's not geography specific anymore. And some of these minilaterals are the Quad and AUKUS. And although both of these arrangements, the Quad and AUKUS in particular, are silent on China, the elephant, or rather the dragon, if you like, in the room, looms large in the background. Brian, how do you see the US's participation in the Quad and AUKUS effectively contributing to regional peace and security, given the US's sharpening divide and differences with China? And how does the US do this without undermining trust, confidence, and stability in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly among the US's more skeptical Southeast Asia partners?
Thanks, Elina, and thanks for putting this together. A lot's already been said, and I certainly associate myself with many of the views, including some of the critiques of where ASEAN is right now, the fact that minilateralism isn't new, but I think this is a timely discussion, and the word minilateralism, is set to be a word that's on the tip of more people's tongues. In your question, you noted that the United States has recently recommitted itself to multilateralism in Asia. But I'd say the broader context is the fact that the United States has committed itself to more engagement with Asia writ large. And the US has been wanting to be engaged however, whenever, wherever in Asia. We're not ideological about this. It's throwing up, as much against the wall in some cases and see what sticks. I mean, for a long time, the question was, though, to engage the region bilaterally or multilaterally, but this was really a false choice. I mean, certainly during the Cold War, the United States relied on its allies and the hub and spokes model to be present in the region. But towards the end of the century, the United States was an early believer in the utility of APEC, of the ASEAN Regional Forum, and we were a bit late to the party and a bit wary at first, but eventually bought into the idea that the East Asia Summit was going to be a very important region, and certainly starting the Obama administration is a real focus. But at the same time, bilateral relations really never took a backseat, and in my view, the United States has tried to, had different objectives with its bilateral engagement and its multilateral engagement in the region. Multilateral engagement is about norm setting, hopefully buying into and building structures that would provide collective security over the mid to long term. But really, you got your business done in bilateral relations. So you're doing different things, you do it at your same time. Certainly, ASEAN countries are deeply bought into the idea of multilateralism and ASEAN centrality. So if you want to have a strong bilateral relationship with a country in Southeast Asia, you better be also engaging in multilateral structures. So the United States was really moving out, in my view, as much as we could, and sometimes not as tactful as possible in all of those formats. These days, really, it's all of the above, and that includes minilateralism. And I think the emergence of the Quad and its newfound prominence really says it all. There's no doubt that minilateralism is now an important part of US engagement in Asia. I don't think that's going to change. So, the bottom line is multilateralism is, I don't know if it's the future of the Indo-Pacific, but certainly going to be part of the future architecture of the region. Getting back to your question, I mean, the premise is interesting too. You asked that, do the Quad and AUKUS effectively contribute to regional peace and security? Pretty fundamental question. I think that question is entirely debatable, but from a US perspective, the answer is clearly yes. And the reason it's yes from a US perspective is because we tend to have supreme confidence that the US having a central role in regional affairs is a fundamental component of regional peace and security. Perhaps, and that more is always better. And there's no question that the Biden administration's focus on the Quad reflects a pessimism about what's possible in existing multilateral structures for many of the reasons that Professor Thitinan noted. But it's also, it's something we haven't talked about is China's role in these institutions. So the fact that China can, through its pressure on a particular member of ASEAN, can make ASEAN ineffective on key issues. The fact that that Russia, and this is going to really come into view this summer. The fact that Russia is part of the East Asia Summit and the ASEAN Regional Forum, part of APEC. I mean, just the membership of these groups, the fact that Russia is part of them, the fact that China can wield such influence because of the way ASEAN operates, just shows that these are important structures and we need to invest in them, but they can't deliver exactly what we want. To the more positive spin on the focus on the Quad is that simply that there's efficiencies and synergies to knitting together our closest bilateral relationships. As Mie Oba noted, this is not new, but it's come into focus. I'd also add to her comments that it's been building blocks along the way, and certainly U.S., Japan, Australia trilateral cooperation was that first important building block, and starting in 2009, 10, 11, and then as the political outlook in India changed, as Japan and Australia became more comfortable in operating together, it built up over time. And certainly, there's efficiencies to giving out a bigger message. It's one thing if the President of the United States and the Prime Minister of Japan give a statement on something. It's another if 4 major world leaders give it. And if we're going to have that same perspective, you might as well do it. I'd say AUKUS is also about efficiencies and synergies. The United States has uniquely close relations, including on defense technology, with Australia and the UK. So basically, why not knit these together and create a bigger sense of purpose? It's not lost on me that this has created some uncertainty in the region, but from a U.S. perspective, it's a why not? There's synergies, there's efficiencies. Why not make them greater than the sum, the greater than the whole? The last point is just like to add to the discussion here is on the Pacific Islands region, which is a part of the Indo-Pacific that is increasingly in focus in Washington. Japan as well, Australia, New Zealand, and you see some of the similar dynamics. I know we mostly have an ASEAN and Quad focused crowd audience here, but in the Pacific, I mean, the main regional forum is the Pacific Islands Forum. It's a vast body with, I should have it off the top of my head, but I think 16 members, including Australia, New Zealand, and all the Pacific Island nations. The United States, Japan, others are not part of it, but we're partners and we participate in a post-forum dialogue. This is a vast region. And the countries of the Pacific Island region have sort of wrestled with similar issues. What can the PIF actually deliver if it's so big? It's too big. In some cases. So there's been increasing salience of what's called the Melanesian Spearhead Group, the group of 4 countries plus some territories in the Melanesian subregion, the Micronesian President Summit, so the presidents of the 5 countries in Micronesia are getting together on a more regular basis. In the United States, for the first time, President Trump hosted the 3 leaders from Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands at the White House. These 3 countries in particular, the United States has deep interest in. And I think that there's the idea of forging minilateral cooperation within the Micronesian subregion is something that the United States is looking closely at about a way to further our interests. Anyway, similar dynamic, and I thought I would introduce that part of it as well. So I'll stop there, Elina, so we can have some time for discussion.
That's great, Brian. I'm so glad you brought up the Pacific Islands. For some reason, ASEAN, maybe because ASEAN is so preoccupied with its own challenges, rarely ever talks about its Pacific Island neighbors. But we have some questions already in the Q&A box as well as in the chat box. A number of the questions relate to the very idea of what minilaterals are and how they differ from multilateralism in general. Perhaps I will start with Professor Oba. If you'd like to offer your thoughts on whether there's a difference in how you see minilaterals compared to the notion of multilateralism as a whole?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for many questions. And then so I'm so glad to have opportunity to answer one question. And then so from my point of view, so multilateralism is based on the logic of the inclusiveness. So it means that so the multilateral forum and the institutions so will so include so all of the countries in the world in the future. So I mean, the United States is a very typical case, and WTO also. Of course, some countries so do not join the WTO yet, but the logic is that so every country will join the WTO. So this is a logic of the inclusiveness. But on the other hand, minilateralism is based on the exclusiveness. I mean, so as Professor Sim said, so and then maybe the like-mindedness or the sharing the strategic interest and concern as a key point to promote so multilateralism. It means that it's very inclusive. So one, this is a very clear the clear difference between the multilateralism and the minilateralism, even though both is composed of the several countries. This is my point. Thank you.
Thank you. I wonder if we were to draw a Venn diagram, whether minilateralism would be embedded within.
The size is more important, but maybe it's more intrinsically the basic logic is very important. So foundation, the logic, the logic on the foundation is very important. So inclusiveness or exclusiveness, this is a more intrinsic difference between them.
Thank you, Professor Oba. I'd like to get another academic's thought on this, Professor Thitinan, before turning to the practitioners for their view.
Yeah, just to follow up on Professor Oba, inclusiveness, exclusiveness is an apt distinction about the difference between multilateralism and minilateralism. So basically, on a spectrum, you have in terms of a definition in principle. If you were to have a spectrum, I mean, one side would be multilateralism, very inclusive. The ultimate would be the World Trade Organization that Professor Oba talked about, or even the UN system. And then, of course, unilateral action would be on the other extreme. And then technically, in terms of definition, minilaterals can be, anywhere along the spectrum. But I think what we mean, regionalism by definition, can be a form of minilateral, right? Short of multilateral. But I think what we're talking about is minilateralism, I think aside from regionalism, and certainly much short of multilateralism and not unilateralism. So it's still about, the ism is still about cooperation, international cooperation, and the wider the better, and the widest is the multilateral, but we're not seeing that anymore. And I think that's because of the rules-based international system is kind of eroding and breaking down. So we're seeing more and more of short of the multilateralism, and minilateralism is coming into its place, and there's a rising trend, and we're going to see more of it, and that's not a good sign, not a good trend, but it's reality.
Thank you. Professor Sothirak, maybe I can broaden the question for you based on one of the questions that was listed in the Q&A box. Apart from weighing in on this idea of whether minilateral is very different from multilateralism, how do you judge the effectiveness and how do you assess the effectiveness of minilaterals? I mean, you alluded to it earlier in your comments. Would you like to expand on that?
Elina, thank you so much for asking this $1 million question. I think the debate here should not go too deep into the characteristic of whatever it is, multilateralism or but to talk about the deliverable. What is it that minilateralism can deliver? Where we know that multilateralism have problem, and whether that going to add value to the revitalizations of multilateralism. That's my point. So I wanted to thank you for asking this question. What is the effectiveness of this minilateralism? what I'm afraid, what will happen is that China have not yet come up with something. They are very reactive also, and they're not going to sit idle. The Anchorage meeting, the first meeting when Joe Biden come into power, that was supposed to show some kind of a cooperative arrangement, but it's not. It's setting China, US on course of collisions all the time. And so China have a lot of, China footprint in Southeast Asia is, in my view, is stronger than the US. And partly is because of Chinese adopted a more developmental approach to build its influence. So multilateralism, I want to ask a question to those particularly member states, including Japan, US, India, and Australia. Whether you see that having this added minilateralism, you really can do something to manage first and foremost US-China rivalry? Can you really can predict what happened in the post-COVID world order when everybody agreed that the liberal international order is declining? These are more pressing issues that we need to ask the delivery from the Quad. If the Quad can do it, if AUKUS can do it, why not? But I'm not so sure at the moment. This exclusiveness is to serve specific interests of a selective grouping. I call it selective multilateralism. By the way, by definition, multilateralism is that if you have more than two, it's already multilateral. If you check the dictionary, it did say like that. So, but it is a selective multilateralism. Is it going to be effective? Where is ASEAN's position itself in this equation? These are issues that we need to discuss. So I think we need to question the effectiveness. Until today, I don't know whether AUKUS or Quad can really solve the problem, the rivalry on the one hand and the decline of the value like democracies and human rights in Myanmar, and now can the Quad do something to stop war in Ukraine? If it can do it, excellent, why not?
Thank you, Ambassador Sothirak. Brian, this question of effectiveness, maybe I'll also paraphrase and group a couple of questions that have come up already and turn to you, Brian, for your response on what you mentioned synergies and efficiencies with some of the US minilaterals, such as the Quad and AUKUS. We've seen, though, that some of these arrangements have met with their challenges. Vaccine diplomacy, for example, early on with the Quad, there were production issues which sort of stifled the effectiveness of the Quad. And so, excuse me, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you see the effectiveness of some of these, perhaps they're not competing, but some of these parallel arrangements. And of course, there's a question of whether AUKUS is even a minilateral or an alliance. Bill Hayton says it's just an arms deal.
Yeah.
Brian?
No, it's a good question. And all good questions. And I think these arrangements are promising. I mean, one that we didn't talk about in any depth, I'm a little surprised actually, that doesn't involve the United States has been these joint patrols in the Sulu Sea. So there's a tangible problem, and three countries, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, have gotten together to try to work on them to get, and it appears that this is successful. And I'm sure there's some details there we don't know, but it just makes sense. It's problem solving in a small way. If that were to develop further, that arrangement could ask for Japanese assistance or U.S. assistance. So that's something solving a particular problem. If we want to call AUKUS minilateral, I'm optimistic. It's going to take way too long, but Australia is going to get some nuclear-powered submarines that they wouldn't have otherwise. I mean, that is, if that's not synergy, I don't know what it is. As a side note on that, to Bill's question, I think we're figuring out, the three countries are still figuring out what AUKUS is. Certainly, it starts with a defense technology agreement and cooperation. But if our three defense enterprises are going to be getting together and meeting on a regular basis, you don't know exactly where that's going to grow and where that's going to go. And just as a practical matter, the three countries are in the process of, I believe it's an 18-month study group process, basically to figure out how to operationalize AUKUS. So I think this is, keep watching this space. Yeah, in general, from a U.S. perspective too, I think one of the biggest risks here is sustaining attention, right? So in an ideal world, there's enough time to do regular bilateral engagements with every country in the region, having 2+2 dialogues with every country that it makes sense to have those with, to show up at every multilateral meeting from the working level up to the leaders level, to engage in these minilateral structures. But you are setting yourself. It's very rare that you sort of get rid of a meeting off the calendar of the year, and ultimately it requires a lot of focus and discipline across multiple administrations to execute these events. I'm pretty confident that the current team in the U.S. administration is going to be able to operate in these multitude of arenas, but it certainly does set a high bar. And when was the last time that we got rid of a meeting in this region? So ultimately, it requires more focus on Asia, more senior level, leaders level, cabinet level, focused on Asia. And frankly, the jury's still out whether we can sustain that focus.
Brian, while I have you here, before I turn to Professor Oba for her response, there's a question related to the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and basically expanding IPEF to the other ASEAN countries, which were initially left out. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yes, so, well, honestly speaking, so I'm so doubtful about effectiveness on the IPEF. So because the many Asian countries, including ASEAN countries, so expect the increasing access to the U.S. market. So I think Biden administration foreign policy is shaped by the middle class diplomacy. It means that the Biden administration do not open their market, U.S. market. And then the Biden administration instead tried to make some rules and regulation and blah, blah, blah about the export control or something. And then, of course, the digital agreement is somewhat beneficial for the Japan and Singapore. But for the other ASEAN countries, what is the benefit of the IPEF? This is very vague for me. And then, I think of course, so I understand the Biden administration want to propose IPEF, and that now Japanese government follow this line. But I'm not from the government official, so I'm a scholar. So from my point of view, IPEF is not so beneficial for many ASEAN countries. So I think the persuasion the ASEAN country to join the IPEF is will not success. Of course, some countries follow, but I don't think that it's not so good strategy for Japan and for the United States. So I'm sorry, so very severe judgment on the IPEF. Thank you.
No, I appreciate the candor. Brian, do you have anything to add?
I don't have deep insight here. I just add one more piece to the puzzle that, certainly it's no secret that trade politics here are very, very difficult in the United States. And, I'm not betting on a return to CPTPP, even after the US midterm elections. But another element is the Biden administration is really putting a lot into the hosting of APEC next year in 2023. And of course, a perennial issue there as it relates to Scott Siemens' question is that all 10 ASEAN countries are not part of APEC. So I think I'm not sure how IPEF relates to APEC and whether that ASEAN, the 7 that are part of APEC are the same that they're but certainly no matter what, there is a ASEAN related challenge here.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Sothirak, there's a question from John Brandon about the postponement of the US-ASEAN summit. And Prime Minister Hun Sen sort of made waves in Washington when he asked for a postponement after the dates had already been declared by the US. Would it make sense for the US to craft trade and economic policies agreements with the more advanced economies of ASEAN while excluding perhaps the lesser developed ASEAN members? Has there been any impact from the US, the postponement of the US-ASEAN summit? Ambassador Sothirak.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, John, for asking the question. I don't think the US-ASEAN summit should keeping postponed. Don't postpone too much. I don't know what's the hiccup there, whether the US or ASEAN, but I tend to believe that the US have some difficulty, maybe technically speaking, the agenda, the timings, and so on and so forth. But if I want to send a message to the US, please do not postpone any further, because ASEAN is ASEAN pay a lot of attention to feeling, not necessarily substance. But if you make ASEAN feel like they being abandoned, it's very difficult. Resetting a very effective US policy for ASEAN require good feeling, trust, and swiftness. And I will be on your side when you need me, kind of things, Brian was mentioning that the US still think that ASEAN is important, Southeast Asia is important to US policy. Show it, do it. Otherwise, it will not be effective. The second part of the question, I don't think it's a good idea for the US to dissect the more advanced economy and the lesser advanced economy and try to come up with a more impactful trade and economic policy and agreement and so on. So forth. I would not want to wish that to happen, because then again, if you will divide and you give more reason for China to come in even stronger. China work well when the country is weaker and it's isolated. It's not too important to the global system. China worked very well, starting with that, and this is also a message for Japan and other, including the EU. So I don't subscribe to the idea that there ought to be a different approach when it comes to resuscitating economic recovery and then focusing on a more advanced. And on contrary, you should look at the weaker one, because there's a lot more liability there if you left it open. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Thitinan, you, towards the end of your remarks earlier on, proposed the idea of ASEAN Plus, so ASEAN founding members plus others. And some would perhaps say that this would undermine ASEAN unity and ASEAN centrality, regionalism as it stands now. What do you say to that? And do you think that there is a positive role for minilateralism in the ASEAN region moving forward?
Thanks, Elina. And I think some of the questions that have been put forward also impinge on this issue about the constitution of ASEAN, the effectiveness of ASEAN. And, the ASEAN that we know it, I think has been around only since 1999, so 23 years. ASEAN as a whole, from the outset, 54 years. It started with 5 countries. So I think, there's multiple dilemmas here. We were talking about IPEF, IPEF, there's a distinction about doing the right thing and doing something that works. Here, I think doing the right thing is to include all ASEAN, always, right? Small states especially, as Ambassador Sothirak said, and then not to divide ASEAN. But the reality that we've been seeing over the past decade is that ASEAN has been divided from outside, certainly, especially as the intensifying rivalry and competition between the US and China has heated up. But at the same time, also ASEAN has been divided from within as well. So if you were to bite the bullet, I think we have to reach for frameworks that work. So doing something that works rather than doing the right thing. Doing the right thing meaning all ASEAN. And you look around Russia, South China Sea, Myanmar, Mekong region, where is it that all ASEAN are in? The lowest common denominator is getting lower and lower. And I think the lower hanging fruits are very few now. So it might come a time that we just have to bite the bullet and do things that work. ASEAN as we know it may have run its course. It doesn't mean that ASEAN is going to disintegrate and be dismantled, and just go away and vanish. It just means that we just have to rethink about how ASEAN can and should work. A major fundamental revamp of the mindset, of the modalities, of the mechanisms. So doing away with consensus, all this kind of informality, the so-called ASEAN way. Doing so, I think one way, as I could operationalize maybe, is to be ASEAN Regional 5+X. And that X could depend on different issue areas, depend on different interests. But if you have the ASEAN 5, the original 5, they can get a lot more done than the whole 10.
Great, thank you. I want to give all the panelists a last chance to respond or address any issues that you think have been missed out. So let's do a rapid fire 30-second to 1 minute round of comments, starting from Professor Oba, if I may.
So yes, so we are facing the very drastically changing regional circumstances and regional order and international order. So it's not only come from the declining of the multilateralism. So I think it's rather come from the rise of the emerging power and the small and middle power in the region. So from my point of view, liberal international order, I mean the Japan and Australia and of course US and ASEAN countries, so have got the benefit. But that order had been led by the advanced country. But now, so China and India and some of the ASEAN countries like the Indonesia, so now there are many the players. So very powerful players. So in the Indo-Pacific, and then it's leading to the multipolar world. So world in this region, and then so it is maybe the intrinsic reason for the rise of the minilateralism. And then so from my point of view, the strategic ambiguity is beneficial for all of us. So because maybe AUKUS and Quad, both of them, so the effectiveness are limited. So, but it's maybe function to keep the India to dialogue regularly, and so it's the China recognize so that their adventurism will not succeed. So because of such many coalitions. So this is a core of the effectiveness of the ambiguous. So the minilateralism in the Indo-Pacific. I think it's okay. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Oba. Ambassador Sothirak, your closing thoughts.
Thank you. I think that I'm the proponent that support multilateralism. I don't think the world needs a competing interest in according to exclusive club design. We need to have a common view about the global problem and to have a common view about the global solution. We need to double our effort to revitalize multilateralism. We cannot stop the creation of multilateralism, because the international system as it is, state is the dominant actor who do whatever it wants to do. But then when we try to solve global issues, we need to place everything on common interests of all, small and big. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Professor Thitinan.
Yes, I agree that we have to keep working on reviving the multilateral system, multilateralism. But if that doesn't work, then we have to be prepared to accept second best, third best outcomes. I think that the minilateralism will increasingly be the go-to way of international cooperation, and it will supersede geography. It will be based on interests and then values in a moving mix. The US has to be able to maintain attention and keep its eye on the ball, going back to Brian's point. I'm not sure if the US can do Russia and Europe and the Atlantic and also the Indo-Pacific. We're watching very carefully. For ASEAN, I think we need some fundamental reforms to make ASEAN whole and workable again. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Thitinan. Don't forget space as well. Brian, round us off, please.
I think I would agree with those points. We've very clearly diagnosed part of the problem that multilateralism isn't delivering as best it should. We need to continue to invest in multilateralism, but I think minilateralism, trilateralism, quadrilateralism, whether that's multilateral or minilateral, it's here to stay. And from a US perspective, it's really going to be all the above, at least for the foreseeable future.
Great. Thank you so much to all four panelists for your wonderful insights. We've had both convergences and divergences in opinion. And I think that's the mark of a really good discussion. I know it's very late in Japan and it's getting quite late in Southeast Asia, depending on which capital you're in. So I'm very grateful for your time. Thank you as well to all of you in the audience for your questions and comments and general participation. Let's keep the conversation going. In the meantime, take care and goodbye.